Imagine a golden chest, ancient and glimmering beneath a desert sun. A box said to carry the voice of God, a force so powerful it split rivers and brought down cities. But buried in its legends, there's something else, a strange detail, the sudden deaths of those who touched it, the searing light that struck without warning, the way it had to be carried, always at a distance, always with care. What if those weren't just myths? What if the Ark of the Covenant, that sacred relic of the Hebrew Bible, wasn't a mere symbol of divine will, but something far more literal? What if it was a machine, and not just any machine, a device humming with energy, a vessel for raw, invisible power, a remnant of a knowledge long lost or erased? Close your eyes, breathe deeply, let the past drift in like mist over ancient stone. You're about to enter a story carved from what remains, and from what may have been taken. Welcome to Deformed History. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. There is something odd about silence in ancient texts. Not the poetic silence of meditation, but the kind that cloaks over what should have been loud. Historical silence. The kind that settles over a story like dust, hiding what once may have burned with fire and motion. That kind of silence lingers around the Ark of the Covenant. We are told it was built at the foot of Mount Sinai, that Moses, having received divine instructions, commissioned artisans to craft it from acacia wood, overlaid with gold, that it housed the stone tablets, the 10 Commandments, and later, a jar of manna and Aaron's rod. But if that were all it was, would it have needed such containment? The ark wasn't just carried. It had to be moved with poles inserted into golden rings, never to be touched directly. It was kept behind layers of fabric and veil. Priests had to purify themselves for days before nearing it. And when it was moved, it often brought death. In the second book of Samuel, a man named Uzzah reaches out to steady the ark as the oxen stumble. His touch is instantaneously fatal. The scripture says the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah. But the description is curious. It reads more like radiation than wrath. Sudden, lethal, no warning. This pattern appears again and again. In 1 Samuel, the Philistines capture the ark and bring it to Ashdod. The people there fall ill. Tumors break out. Panic spreads. The ark is passed from city to city, each one succumbing to sickness and fear, until the Philistines finally send it back. It's returned not as a conquered relic, but as a dangerous burden they could no longer contain. What kind of object produces such effects? Not only spiritual awe, but physiological decay. Let's widen the frame. Across different eras, different places, objects appear in myth and history that are treated with similar reverence and fear. The Vajra, in Hindu and Buddhist texts, said to be a thunderbolt weapon. The Greek aegis, carried by Athena, described as radiant and untouchable. The mysterious shamir of Solomon, which could cut through stone without striking it. But the ark stands apart because its descriptions were so detailed, not just in function, but in form. The dimensions, the materials, the construction instructions, written almost like a technical manual. That is what first stirred the curiosity of some physicists and engineers who stumbled on these texts not as believers, but as readers with scientific habits. They noticed something unnerving. The Ark's properties resembled, in uncanny ways, a rudimentary nuclear device. Not a bomb, nothing explosive, but a source. A compact, controlled emitter of energy. The kind of thing that, if mishandled, could cause nausea, tumors, burns. The kind of thing that could kill quietly. Of course, the natural response is skepticism. Isn't this just another case of modern minds projecting technology into old stories? Isn't this a pattern of wishful interpretation? And yet, the silence around the Ark's disappearance is just as loud as its effects when present. After the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the Ark vanishes from all records, not stolen, not destroyed, just absent. The Bible doesn't tell us clearly what happened. The Talmud speculates. The Ethiopian church claims to guard it, but no definitive trace has ever emerged. If it had simply been a golden box, wouldn't its fate be easier to record? Now think about containment. The Ark was said to be kept inside the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the temple in Jerusalem, a space only one priest could enter, once a year. Even then, he did so with bells on his garments, a rope tied to his ankle, so he could be pulled out if he died inside. These are not precautions for something symbolic. They are protocols of danger. Many temples and sacred sites throughout the ancient world had inner sanctums, but rarely with such an intense boundary, and rarely with such consequences for breach. Could the temple have been, in part, a containment facility? Could the rituals of purification, the veils, the distance, have been not only spiritual barriers, but protective measures? A chilling idea, if so, that those ancient priests were not only guardians of faith, but caretakers of something volatile, something misunderstood, yet obeyed. And what of the design itself? Acacia wood is light but dense, overlaid with gold, a powerful conductor. Inside, stone tablets, yes, but perhaps something else. The biblical instructions mention a mercy seat with two cherubim facing each other, wings outstretched above. Between them, the voice of God would speak. Or was that a metaphor? Or was it describing something like an ionizing arc? A radiant emission point? The idea is uncomfortable. It collapses the wall between myth and machine, between religion and engineering. But perhaps that wall was thinner in antiquity than we assume. Perhaps our ancestors didn't separate the divine from the physical as neatly as we do. If the Ark was a device, then where did it come from? Was it built by human hands using forgotten knowledge? Or was it inherited, salvaged from a prior age? An age wiped out, reset, and remembered only in fragments. Because here lies the deeper unease. Civilizations before ours may have risen, fallen, and left behind traces too strange to decode. And if such a device did exist, one so dangerous that entire cities feared it, so sacred that only a few dared approach, then it makes sense that someone, someday, chose to erase it, to protect others, or to keep the power for themselves. Perhaps that's why we're left with half-phrases, ritual echoes, veiled warnings. Perhaps that's why what should have been a defining artifact in human history became a ghost. But one detail still presses at the mind, whispering through the centuries. When the Ark was opened, those few terrible times, there were reports of light. Not soft, but searing. White, blinding. And it wasn't always seen with the eyes. Sometimes it was felt, like a hum beneath the skin, like vibration in the bones. Is that what holiness feels like? Or is that what radiation feels like? We'll never know for certain. But then again, maybe someone still does. Somewhere. The silence after Jerusalem fell was not just political. It was archival, religious, liturgical. The temple was in ruins, the priests scattered or slain. The center of ritual, the Holy of Holies, stood exposed, desecrated. And yet, the Ark was not there. The Babylonians took everything of value, the menorahs, the vessels, the scrolls, but not the Ark. The chroniclers of that time listed their spoils with precision, as if they knew history would one day scrutinize them. And in all those lists, the Ark is conspicuously missing. No mention, no theft, no destruction, just absence. How do you lose the most sacred object in your religion? How do you not record its fate? One tradition says the priests hid it, burying it beneath the Temple Mount in secret chambers. Another claims it was carried out before the siege, spirited away to Egypt or further south. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has long maintained that it rests today in Aksum, in a chapel guarded day and night by a single monk who can never leave. But these stories lack evidence. No archaeologist has ever found a chamber beneath the Temple Mount, not one that can be excavated. Political tensions make the area almost impossible to study. The chapel in Aksum does not allow visitors inside. The monk never speaks. No photographs, no instruments, only faith and shadow. It's as if the Ark has become not just an object, but a symbol of disappearance itself. But what if the silence wasn't accidental? History is often curated by those in power. The victors write chronicles. The institutions select which relics to preserve. What if, in the aftermath of the temple's fall, the Ark was not merely lost, but deliberately erased? Because some truths are too dangerous to remember. Throughout history, we see moments when knowledge is suppressed. The Library of Alexandria burned, Mayan codices destroyed, entire languages wiped out through conquest. We often imagine these as acts of cruelty or of ignorance, but occasionally they seem calculated, surgical. What if the knowledge embedded in the Ark, its function, its nature, its threat, was deemed unfit to be passed down? Perhaps not even by tyrants, but by the priests themselves, not an act of destruction, but of protection. This brings us to the curious case of the Essenes, a sect of Jewish mystics active around the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE. The Essenes lived in the desert, apart from temple authorities. They believed in secrecy, in preparation, in the end of days. And they kept scrolls. Hundreds were discovered in the Qumran caves in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among them were apocalyptic visions, strange rules for priestly behavior, references to sacred objects lost to time. One fragment, labeled 4Q285, speaks of a Son of God who will be pierced and die. Another, from the Copper Scroll, lists a hidden treasure, vessels of gold and silver buried beneath landmarks no longer known. Many scholars believe this is metaphor. Others think it's a coded map. And a few wonder if the Ark is among the treasures. But here's the oddity. The Qumran community seemed obsessed with purity, with rituals surrounding light and darkness, with detailed temple procedures. Yet they make almost no mention of the Ark directly. Was that silence deliberate? Was it reverence or fear? If the Essenes were preserving secret knowledge, they may have known or suspected that the Ark was not simply a relic, but something active, dormant perhaps, but not inert. There are echoes, too, in early Christian writings. The book of Revelation describes a future vision of heaven opening, and the Ark of the Covenant appearing within the temple of God, accompanied by lightning, earthquakes, and hail. Strange imagery for an object supposedly lost 6 centuries earlier, unless the Ark is more than a memory, unless its power, real or symbolic, was always meant to return. Let's pause here for a moment. Let the idea sink in. The Ark as an object of containment, an object of energy, a sacred reactor. It seems outlandish, but not entirely beyond the realm of possibility. In fact, when engineers and historians began to examine the biblical descriptions, a few found themselves quietly speculating. Could an ancient civilization, perhaps long before Moses, have understood radioactivity? Could the Ark have been constructed to house or shield a fragment of a radioactive element? Uranium, thorium, plutonium. These exist in nature, in small deposits. They can be handled briefly with care. They emit heat, light, harm. A civilization that stumbled upon them or inherited a fragment from a meteorite might build around it the only thing they understood: ritual. Ceremony becomes containment. Taboo becomes safety protocol. Over generations, the reason is forgotten. But the rituals remain. This theory would explain the dangers surrounding the Ark's touch. The tumors, the death of Uzzah, the plagues among the Philistines, the strict carrying methods, the veil, the sanctification. It would also explain the fear, why the Ark had to be hidden, not destroyed, why it couldn't fall into imperial hands, because whoever controlled it controlled a terrible power. There are whispers, unsubstantiated but persistent, that during the 20th century, military historians in Europe and the United States studied Ark-related texts as part of classified efforts. Operation Paperclip, Project Blue Book, and other post-war initiatives sometimes included odd forays into religious or occult documents, officially dismissed. But the records are thin, and many remain sealed. Were they merely curious? Or was there something more? Did they think the Ark might be real? And if it was real, was it still out there, still active? The mind drifts even now to those desert places: Ethiopia, Egypt, the caves of Qumran, the vaults beneath ancient cathedrals, places where time has stalled, where silence stretches deep, and in that silence, perhaps something still hums. There's a moment that often slips past unnoticed in discussions of sacred artifacts, a moment when the physical and the metaphysical blur. It happens not in grand declarations, but in the quiet rituals: the washing of hands, the tying of sashes, the lighting of a lamp before entering a chamber. These acts were more than ceremony. They were instruction, warnings etched in repetition. The priests of ancient Israel weren't just theologians. They were technicians of something they didn't fully control. And among all their duties, none required more care than approaching the Ark. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, was the only time the high priest entered the Holy of Holies. Before doing so, he had to bathe multiple times, change into special garments, and offer sacrifices to atone not just for himself, but for the nation. Then, carrying incense to create a veil of smoke, he would approach the Ark. The smoke, they said, was to shield his eyes from the divine presence. Or was it a rudimentary radiation shield? It's easy to scoff. Incense is not lead. Smoke does not block gamma rays. But if the priesthood was working from tradition rather than knowledge, their methods might have evolved from partial understanding. They knew the effects. They feared the light. So they layered protections: clothing, purification, distance, ritual, to guard against something no longer named. What strikes the modern reader is the language of caution, of proximity, of thresholds. The same logic that governs a nuclear facility today. You don't stand too close. You don't enter without clearance. You don't touch what you don't fully understand. This is where the thread becomes unsettling, because such patterns aren't unique to the Ark. They echo in other civilizations. Consider the ancient Sanskrit texts of India. The Mahabharata, an epic dated to at least the 8th century BCE, describes weapons that glow with the brightness of 1,000 suns, cause hair and nails to fall out, and poison the land for generations. These are often dismissed as poetic exaggerations, but a handful of researchers, particularly in the mid-20th century, read them differently, as descriptions of something nuclear. Similarly, the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh speaks of a radiant thing, guarded by scorpion men, capable of burning those who approach. In Egypt, certain priests were tasked with handling the fire of Ra, a metaphor perhaps, but one that always involved secrecy, isolation, and danger. Could these be cultural echoes of the same kind of knowledge? Scattered memories of encounters with a kind of energy that later generations could no longer explain? If so, the Ark wasn't alone. It was part of a lost grammar, a language of power no longer spoken. And that raises a more disturbing question. If the Ark and objects like it were technological in nature, who built them? Not Moses. He received instructions. But from where? The text says God, a voice from the mountain, a pillar of fire. But let's pull back. What if Mount Sinai itself, described as shrouded in smoke, trembling and impossible to approach, was not simply a site of divine encounter, but of technology, an installation, an ancient complex reawakened? Some researchers have floated the theory that certain locations on Earth were once centers of pre-human or early advanced civilization, nodes of energy or information left behind after a cataclysm. Atlantis, as Plato hinted, was only one of many. These theories are controversial, often fringe, but they persist because of one unrelenting fact. We keep finding things we can't explain. Pumapunku in Bolivia. Stone cut so precisely it resembles laser work. The Osirian in Egypt, foundations older than the temples above them. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. A megalithic site 12,000 years old, built with skill unaccounted for by the archaeology of its time. We're not lacking in evidence, we're lacking in context, and context is often what power removes. Back to the Ark. Suppose, just for a moment, that Moses was not simply building a vessel of worship, but replicating a design he found, or was given. That would make him not a prophet engineer, but a custodian, a follower of instructions whose source was veiled, possibly even from him. This changes the story. It turns Exodus from a tale of covenant into a tale of contact. Contact with something or someone who once knew how to harness energy in forms we can barely contain today. If the Ark was such a device, and it was hidden, it wasn't to protect its symbolism. It was to prevent misuse, or perhaps, even worse, replication. And that may explain why, after the temple fell, no one rebuilt it. Zerubbabel's temple stood on the same site, but it was smaller, lacking many of the original artifacts. Herod's renovations made it grand, but still no Ark. It had become untouchable, or perhaps untouchably dangerous. The fear was no longer just theological. It was operational, practical. Priests may have whispered of angels, but in the silence, they remembered what happened when you stepped too close. and somewhere in that silence, the Ark was buried. Perhaps not in earth, but in language, in metaphor, in stories told to children with the edges rounded off. But the truth, jagged and humming, was still there. Still is, because the question remains open. Not where is the Ark, but what was it, and what would happen if it were found? Would we worship it, study it, fear it, or try to turn it back on? There's a strange loneliness in old blueprints, the kind where something has been carefully diagrammed piece by piece, yet the purpose is missing. You see the wires, the casings, the measurements, but no explanation for why they were arranged just so. That's the feeling some scholars report when studying the biblical description of the Ark. It is not a vague allegory. It's a set of instructions. 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 wide, 1.5 high. Gold inside and out. A rim or crown of gold around the top. Rings at each corner, poles never removed. Cherubim with wings extended, facing each other, forming what is called the mercy seat. And from between those wings, a voice would speak. We're told this is where God's presence would manifest. But for a mind trained in mechanics, or circuits, or electromagnetism, these details suggest more than symbolism. They suggest circuitry. Could the cherubim have formed some kind of conduit? Could the gold plating, the precise dimensions, the layers of separation, all play roles not in aesthetic design, but in function? In high-voltage equipment today, design is about control, about channeling flow, about shielding. Perhaps to those ancient priests, the Ark was never explained in such terms, but the effects were real. It killed, it vibrated, it made people sick. It was feared even by those who protected it, and that fear shaped theology. Because sometimes what we call divine is just misunderstood danger. The late physicist Jeremy Oppenheim, a lesser-known colleague of early nuclear researchers in the 1940s, once gave a private lecture in which he compared the Ark to what he called a passive core device, something capable of storing energy without initiating release unless conditions are disturbed. No official paper followed. No diagrams were published, but his notes, recovered decades later by a graduate researcher going through archived university boxes, described a sealed containment vessel made with insulating and conductive materials, housing a radiant core of unknown energy signature. He didn't name the Ark directly, but in the margins, in faint pencil, was scribbled Exodus 25. The reference was unmistakable. Others have speculated even further, that the Ark was not built around an energy source, but was the source, that its very structure was an artifact from an earlier civilization, possibly even non-human, embedded with something akin to a compact reactor or emitter. There is, of course, no physical proof. But there is pattern. Objects throughout history, revered not for their beauty but for their effects. The Benben stone in Egyptian myth, said to descend from the heavens, emitting light. The Leah phial in Ireland, said to cry out under the foot of a true king. The black stone in Mecca, which pilgrims kiss through protective casing but whose origin remains unknown. Each of these, wrapped in myth, approached with reverence, untouchable without ritual, suggests something shared across time and culture. Memory of contact with power beyond understanding, and always, the power is veiled. Veiling is a theme worth pausing on. The Ark was veiled behind a curtain. The priest was veiled in smoke. Even the stories that reference the Ark seem to do so with caution, as if language itself trembles before the object. The Greek word apocalypsis, which gives us apocalypse, originally meant unveiling, to reveal what has been hidden. But in the case of the Ark, the closer you look, the more the veils multiply. What should be central to Judeo-Christian history, what should be endlessly discussed, detailed, displayed, is instead absent. Churches carry no replicas. Museums hold no fragments. Even in theological discourse, the Ark is treated more like a rumor than a relic. Why? There are two possible explanations. Either it never existed, and the stories are myth, or it existed, and someone decided it was better forgotten. Because the moment something becomes real, it becomes dangerous, not just to bodies, but to institutions. A real Ark suggests real power. Not metaphorical, not symbolic, actual power, and real power challenges authority. If a device existed that could kill at a distance, cause sickness, emit light, and change weather patterns, as some fringe interpretations suggest, then no modern structure of religion or politics would want it reintroduced. It would destabilize belief, rewrite physics, demand control. Perhaps that's why the Ark is remembered in whispers, and perhaps that's why the few who claim to guard it, like the monks in Ethiopia, do not allow it to be tested. Not out of superstition, but out of knowing. This brings us inevitably to the question of intent. If the Ark was a machine, who made it? And more haunting still, why? Was it given as a tool, a weapon, a test? The book of Exodus says the Ark was to be placed in the Holy of Holies, and that from between the cherubim I will speak with you. The phrasing is striking. Not just that a divine voice would be heard, but that the place it would emerge from was precisely located. Between two conductive forms, above a gold-covered box, in a sealed chamber, not unlike the placement of a speaker, or a transmitter, or a warning system. What if the Ark was not meant to be an object of worship, but a device for communication, one that required conditions to activate, one that perhaps hasn't spoken in centuries because those conditions are no longer met, or because the listener no longer dares to answer? What remains is the silence, but not an empty silence, a heavy one, the kind that suggests not absence, but containment, the kind you find in bunkers, in sealed rooms, in stories told by those who survived something too strange to name. And so the Ark lingers, not just in scripture, but in the margins of modern thought, in the footnotes of physics, in the rumors of war zones where unmarked crates are buried under sand. And always in the question no one wants to ask aloud, if the Ark was a machine, where is it now? And what would it mean to turn it back on? There's a strange kind of fear that arises when we look at something that shouldn't exist, not the monstrous or the grotesque, but the precise. A level of sophistication that has no place in the time it's found. A mechanism so advanced it seems to stare back at us across the ages, asking not how, but why. The Ark is not alone in this. In 1901, a sponge diver off the coast of the Greek island Antikythera found what he thought was a statue. It turned out to be a corroded mass of bronze gears. At first, no one understood it, but when it was cleaned and studied, something remarkable was revealed. A machine with at least 30 meshing bronze gears designed to predict astronomical positions and eclipses. A computer, in effect, built in the 2nd century BCE. The Antikythera mechanism shattered assumptions. It shouldn't have existed. The Greeks, we thought, didn't have that kind of mechanical knowledge. But there it was. Not myth, not metaphor, a real device, built by real hands, misunderstood for centuries. Now think of the Ark in that light, not as a symbol but as an artifact. What if it wasn't a one-of-a-kind anomaly, but a remnant of something larger? A surviving piece from a culture or a collaboration that had knowledge we lost. There is a theory, whispered in certain circles, that the Ark is a descendant object. Not unique, but the last functioning unit of a class of devices once used across regions, perhaps even continents. Devices not of worship, but of control, regulation, communication. Imagine a network of such arks, anchored in temples, aligned with stars, tended by priests who became specialists not through inspiration, but through instruction. It's not such a leap. Many ancient temples are aligned with celestial bodies. The Great Pyramid, Angkor Wat, Teotihuacan. Structures with alignments so precise, they track solstices, lunar cycles, even precession. Were these just acts of devotion or calibration? The Ark, if placed at the center of such a system, might have served more than spiritual purpose. It might have functioned as a receiver or a beacon. Some researchers have even wondered if the strange descriptions of the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night that accompanied the Israelites in the desert were manifestations of the Ark's activation, or perhaps effects of a larger field it was designed to interface with. These questions spiral. They challenge the idea that human history has followed a linear ascent, that we began in caves and climbed, slowly, toward modernity. But what if the climb was not upward, but circular? What if we rose, fell, and rose again, and in the falling, some things were buried? This is not simply conjecture. Throughout the world, there are flood myths. Nearly every culture has a story of great destruction, often by water, fire, or both. These are not all biblical echoes. The Epic of Gilgamesh predates Genesis. The Hindu Puranas speak of Manu, warned by a fish to build a boat before a great deluge. In Mesoamerican myth, humans of a former age were destroyed by flood and darkness. Are these mere metaphors for seasonal disasters? Or do they preserve memories of real global cataclysm? If so, what knowledge drowned with them? If the Ark predates Moses, it may have come from a civilization that once knew how to generate or channel energy in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. Civilizations that might have encoded their machines in religious language, because that was the only framework that survived. Imagine you are a priest 5 generations after the collapse. The texts are fragmented. The builders are gone. But the box remains, glowing, humming, dangerous. You enshrine it because it works. You build rituals because it responds. You call it divine because no other word fits. The function is no longer understood. But the effects are real. This is how myth is born, not from lies, but from partial memory. There's an ache to that idea, a sadness that we might be living in the aftermath, not the origin, that the greatest technologies ever created are already behind us, forgotten, misnamed, hidden in plain sight. And this brings us to the question of ethics. If the Ark was rediscovered, truly rediscovered, and verified as a device, not a relic, what would we do? Science would clamor to study it. Governments would rush to possess it. Religious authorities might deny or fight or fracture, because the implications would be unbearable. Not just that our ancestors were more advanced than we think, but that they knew what we don't. How to contain power, how to fear it, how to hide it when necessary. We, who split atoms to boil water, who launch satellites to sell ads, who build AI to mimic attention. Are we the ones to inherit such a thing? The Ark, in its silence, may be asking that. Not just, what am I? But, are you ready? There's something haunting about an object whose purpose is unknown, but whose risk is felt. We approach such things carefully. Or not at all. And so it waits, somewhere, maybe under stone, maybe behind veils, maybe within a story we no longer read aloud, not as a mystery, but as a warning. There are places on Earth where silence feels engineered, not just quiet, but arranged, like the absence was designed. You feel it beneath stone vaults, in the airless chambers of ancient temples, or while standing near ruins older than history remembers. The silence presses in, and you realize someone built this not to be heard, but not to be forgotten. One such place is Tannis, once the capital of ancient Egypt, now mostly ruins buried in desert winds. It is here, in crumbled columns and sun-scorched granite, that a strange rumor lives. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as European archaeologists began their excavation campaigns, stories surfaced, quiet at first, then whispered among researchers, that Tannis had once held something that should not have been there. A chest, gilded, revered, hidden beneath layers of stone and earth, sealed away by those who feared what it could do. Official reports mention no such find. But in journals never published, and letters between archaeologists stored in archives few ever open, there are hints. One letter, dated 1903, refers to a sealed chamber containing a gold-plated object not aligned with Egyptian typology. Another, written by a field assistant, speaks of a strange burn experienced after entering a room thought to be untouched for millennia. No photographs, no evidence, just absence, and the suggestion that whatever was found was quietly removed. What makes Tannis particularly eerie is its sudden abandonment. Once a thriving city, it was left behind without obvious cause, its artifacts scattered, its records silent, and in the void, speculation grows. Some believe the Ark was never taken to Jerusalem, but brought to Egypt, perhaps during the reign of Shishak, who raided the temple and returned with treasure. The Bible itself says Shishak took the treasures of the house of the Lord, but doesn't say whether that included the Ark. If it did, and if it was brought to Tannis, it may have rested there for centuries, worshipped, feared, sealed, until it was no longer manageable. The Tannis theory was considered fringe until the mid-20th century, when documents declassified from World War II revealed that Nazi agents had conducted archaeological digs in Egypt, not just in search of artifacts, but in pursuit of power. The Ahnenerbe, a research institute created by Heinrich Himmler, was tasked with finding the origins of the so-called Aryan race. But beneath that cover, they hunted relics of rumored power, the Spear of Destiny, the Holy Grail, and, yes, the Ark of the Covenant. One declassified file mentions Egypt by name, and a short, cryptic phrase, Tannis site, unsuitable for extraction. What does that mean? That they found something? That they couldn't remove it? Or that they were warned? It's easy to dismiss these documents as products of paranoia or myth-making, but the people involved believed in what they were doing. And sometimes, belief shapes reality, especially when belief is backed by money, soldiers, and science. If the Ark was at Tannis, even briefly, then its journey is more complex than tradition allows. It would mean that the narrative of Exodus wasn't a straight line, but a circle, that the object began in Egypt, left, and returned, and perhaps never left again. But why would the Egyptians keep it? They worshipped many gods. They built massive temples, constructed shrines of gold and stone. What place would a Hebrew object have among them? Unless it was never solely Hebrew, unless the ark and the technology or energy it contained was something more ancient, predating all the traditions that claimed it, a shared inheritance, misunderstood by all. That's the thread scholars fear to pull, because if the ark is older than Moses, older than Sinai, older than the desert wanderings, then the foundation of three major religions becomes complicated. It suggests that what was received as revelation may have been recognition. That Moses did not create the ark, but was taught to carry it. And that others, pharaohs, priests, conquerors, tried to do the same. But only some survived. Here's where things grow darker. There are reports, scattered, unverifiable, of sicknesses among early archaeologists working near suspected ark locations. Of sudden skin lesions, loss of hair, violent fevers. At the time, these were blamed on local bacteria or toxins in tomb dust. But some symptoms resemble acute radiation exposure. Again, there is no proof, only silence. But a pattern of silence begins to resemble design. And when silence surrounds the same object across centuries and continents, one has to wonder, was it enforced? Because silence, unlike forgetfulness, often has a purpose: to hide, to protect, or to control. It's easy to imagine a world where the ark is just a myth, a story for children filled with fire and angels and golden boxes. But it's harder to explain how that story grew so specific, how its dimensions were recorded with precision, how its movements affected cities, how its presence caused death, even among its caretakers. That doesn't feel like myth. It feels like containment, which brings us to the present. If the ark was buried beneath Jerusalem, beneath Tannis, beneath Story, what happens if someone digs too deep? In the age of satellite archaeology, LIDAR, and AI-driven excavation maps, it's only a matter of time before something is found. And if it is, will it be studied, weaponized, silenced again? We are very good at forgetting. But we are even better at rediscovering what should have remained lost. And the ark, if it is real, if it is still out there, may not be dormant forever. Objects like that don't just wait, they call. There's something deeply unsettling about objects that wait. Unlike living things, they do not tire, decay, or forget. They simply remain. In caves, in vaults, in stories, and occasionally, in places where someone stumbles too close. In 1989, a team of maintenance workers beneath the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem reportedly uncovered a sealed chamber while reinforcing structural supports. The incident was barely mentioned in official records, but rumors spread quickly through local communities. Whispers spoke of strange lights, unusual heat, and a sudden order to reseal the chamber without investigation. There is no proof, no photograph, no witness on record. But the location is notable. According to tradition, the Ark of the Covenant was housed in the first temple built by Solomon, on that very site. When the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, the Ark vanished. The second temple, lacking the Ark, functioned more as a replica. And after its own destruction by the Romans in 70 CE, the site changed hands many times, until the Islamic shrine, now known as the Dome of the Rock, was built over the same ground. What lies beneath has long been a source of mystery and conflict. Excavations are restricted, Politics and faith guard the site more fiercely than any fence, but every so often a whisper escapes. A story of a tunnel bricked too quickly, a photograph that disappears, a guard who will not speak of what he saw. And always the same feeling. Something is under there, something still powerful. If the Ark was ever buried, the Temple Mount would be the most likely place. Some traditions claim it was hidden by priests before the Babylonian siege, placed in a secret chamber designed for such a moment. If so, it may still be there, encased in stone, sealed in a vault built not to preserve it, but to contain it. And that raises the question no one wants to ask. What happens if it's opened? What if the Ark was not destroyed, not stolen, not myth, but sealed away because it was too dangerous, not spiritually but physically? Because it emits, because it destabilizes, because it acts. The biblical stories suggest as much. When the Philistines returned the Ark after a plague, it was sent on a cart pulled by cows. They didn't dare approach. When it reached the town of Beth Shemesh, some men peeked inside. They died. The number varies across manuscripts. Some say 70, others more than 50,000. The narrative is blurred, perhaps deliberately, but the pattern is consistent. Exposure equals death. And not just to enemies. Even priests were vulnerable. The Ark was not loyal. It was not kind. It was governed by function, not favor. It obeyed laws older than Scripture. Laws we now call physics. And perhaps something more. Because if the Ark was technological, if it emitted radiation or contained a power source, it wasn't only a weapon, it was a question left unanswered for centuries. And the longer it remained unanswered, the more dangerous it became. Because now, in the present, we stand on a precipice. Our technology allows us to locate underground anomalies, ground-penetrating radar, muon imaging, seismic mapping, tools that can see what Earth and time have hidden. But should we? There's a reason the Ark was always approached slowly, with purification, with ritual, with awe. These weren't just religious behaviors. They were inherited warnings. Don't rush, don't touch, don't assume. Modern science does not do ritual. It does precision. It drills, extracts, measures. But the Ark doesn't play by those rules. And what if, in uncovering it, we trigger something we don't understand? There's a passage in the second book of Kings that rarely gets quoted. It speaks of a fire that consumed soldiers sent to arrest the prophet Elijah. A chariot of flame, a whirlwind. To many, it's poetry, but to some, those who study plasma physics, who examine electromagnetic disturbances, it sounds like something else, an event, a discharge, an encounter with energy misread as miracle. And if such encounters occurred before, they can occur again. So we come back to the idea of containment, of silence, of waiting, because the most dangerous things in history are not those that scream, they are those that hum, steady, low, persistent. The Ark, if it still exists, may be humming now. Not loudly, not audibly, but in a frequency only certain instruments or instincts can feel. Perhaps that's why some people, when near specific places, Jerusalem, Tannis, Axum, report unease, headaches, disorientation. Perhaps that's why animals sometimes refuse to enter certain ruins. Perhaps it's not imagination. Perhaps it's proximity. And perhaps the Ark is not a relic to be found, but a presence already known, embedded in the background of our world like an undetected signal. Waiting not to be discovered, but to be re-understood, that's the deeper fear, not that we'll find the Ark, but that we already have, and didn't recognize it, because recognition requires memory, and memory in the human species is fragile. We forget what we can't explain, and we mythologize what we can't forget. So the Ark becomes a story, a golden box, a Sunday school drawing, a prop in a movie. But beneath all that, the hum remains. And those who hear it? They rarely speak. Some questions don't fade. They wait, beneath layers of dust, behind closed eyes, inside locked drawers of half-forgotten archives, and every now and then, they surface. Quietly, persistently, like something tapping through the wall of accepted history. One such question appeared in a 1947 British intelligence memo. It wasn't classified as urgent. It was short, handwritten, and marked with a curious phrase, "Potential anomalous object, Addis Ababa vicinity." Most who read it moved on, but a few circled back, because that same phrase, anomalous object, had been used before. During the war, and always in connection with artifacts, not weapons, not technology, but things that shouldn't exist, or rather, things that exist, and don't make sense. The memo referred to a church. Small, ancient, tucked into the hills of Ethiopia, the Church of Mary of Zion. Locals claimed it housed the Ark of the Covenant. This wasn't news to scholars. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had made this claim for centuries. But what caught the intelligence officer's attention was the reference to a strange energy signature detected near the church by a passing military aircraft. Anomalies in magnetism, unexplained interference on communication channels. Again, no follow-up, no formal report, just the note. And silence. But the location matters. Ethiopia's claim to the Ark isn't built on folklore alone. The Kebra Nagast, a 14th century text, traces the lineage of Ethiopian royalty to the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. It tells a story that their son, Menelik III, visited Jerusalem, and when he returned home, he brought with him the Ark, either with Solomon's blessing or by divine intervention. Western scholars have often dismissed this as national myth-making, but the Ethiopian Church treats it as truth. The chapel that houses the Ark, according to their account, is not entered by anyone except a single guardian monk. He is appointed for life. He cannot leave. He cannot speak of what he protects. No one else may look upon the Ark, not even the patriarch, not even the government. Skeptics argue this is convenient, a claim that can't be proven or disproven, a myth given walls and guarded silence. But a few researchers, granted limited access to the grounds, not the chapel itself, but its vicinity, have reported something strange, that electronics behave erratically nearby, that magnetic instruments fail, that animals avoid the perimeter. Nothing definitive, nothing published in peer-reviewed journals. But then again, stories like this never are. They live on the edge of what's allowed, which raises the question, if the Ark is truly there, why hasn't it been taken, studied, displayed? The answer may be simpler than it seems, because those who protect it believe in it, not just as an object of reverence, but as something still alive. And belief can be more powerful than any fence, but belief can also obscure. There's a theory, rarely spoken in formal settings, that the Ethiopian Ark is not the original, but a duplicate, one of several made in antiquity to protect the location of the true object. These duplicates, called tablets, exist in many Ethiopian churches. They are treated with equal reverence, covered, veiled, carried in sacred processions. Some are said to contain nothing, others, something unknown. Could the original Ark have been replicated, copied? Could artisans, working from memory or divine instruction, have tried to rebuild what had already begun to fade from understanding? If so, the object in Axum may be a vessel, symbolic, powerful in belief but inert. Or it may be something more. There is one curious detail that lends weight to the Axum claim. In 2020, during regional conflict, the town of Axum was invaded. In the chaos, reports emerged, unverified, conflicting, of attempts to enter the chapel. Some said the Guardian was killed, others said the Ark was moved. No footage ever surfaced. The international press focused on human tragedy, as it should. But in the background, a few intelligence analysts began asking quiet questions. Why was that site targeted? Why then? And why, when the dust settled, did everyone stop talking about it? It's possible the chapel was simply collateral, or it was something more, a test, a retrieval, or a warning. Because if the Ark was moved, if it still exists as a functioning object, not just a relic, then its silence may be coming to an end. That's the tension humming beneath all this. Not that the Ark was real once, but that it might still be active now. And the moment someone tries to control it again, the old stories could replay. Only this time, the witnesses would have cameras. The consequences, satellites, the interpretations, immediate and global. A sudden burst of light, a wave of illness, a signal no one can trace. And the question would return, not just in quiet corners of theology or fringe science, but in headlines. What is this thing? Who built it? And what have we awakened? Because the Ark, if it exists, has always functioned on a principle we rarely discuss: proximity. The closer you get, the more real it becomes, the more it reveals, and perhaps the more it reacts. So maybe that chapel in Ethiopia isn't just a tomb for a forgotten object. Maybe it's a circuit, waiting to close. The deeper you go into the Ark's story, the more the lines begin to blur, not between fact and fiction, but between what is known and what is left deliberately unspoken. Across time, through texts, ruins, and rituals, a pattern emerges, not of clarity, but of concealment. A design of forgetting. And it's not always ancient. In 1952, during a topographic survey of the Negev desert in southern Israel, a geophysicist working for a British-funded team noted an anomalous electromagnetic reading near a dry wadi, an old seasonal riverbed. He logged the location, filed the report, and thought little more of it. Years later, in a personal letter, he wrote something strange. "I don't know what it was," he said, "but it felt like the earth was humming, not sound, vibration, and the air smelled wrong, like something burned long ago and never fully went out." He had no reason to connect it to the Ark, but someone did. In the late 1970s, Israeli defense forces began securing access to that same region under the cover of archaeological exploration. No public dig followed, but satellite images, at least the ones not blurred or redacted, showed infrastructure that didn't match known installations: grids, power sources, vents. Then silence. No publication, no follow-up, just that same humming void. And the question that keeps appearing in unexpected corners: what exactly are we circling? Because if the Ark wasn't just moved, but hidden by design, then modern efforts to retrieve it may not be discovery, but interference. A breach of a long-standing barrier, or worse, a trigger. You see, containment isn't always about protection from theft. Sometimes it's about insulation, keeping something that reacts from reacting. This is not a new fear. Ancient languages had terms that might now be translated not as sacred, but as dangerous to approach. In Sumerian, Melamu, an aura or radiance that surrounded gods and temples, often described as overwhelming, even lethal. In the Hebrew tradition, kavod, the glory of God, was described as a fire, a cloud, a presence so intense that mortals had to shield their eyes. In Hindu texts, certain weapons, like the Brahmastra, were said to destroy entire regions, to be used only with strict moral permission. These weren't metaphors for divine wrath. They may have been attempts to describe actual phenomena, energetic, environmental, physical effects beyond the scientific vocabulary of the time. If the Ark is part of that forgotten language, an object not of worship but of power, then its silence may not mean it is inert. It may mean it is dormant, waiting for conditions, waiting for someone to finish the sentence. This brings us to a concept rarely discussed in the mainstream: responsive artifacts, that is, objects which interact with their environment, which change state based on inputs, pressure, light, sound, proximity, in modern terms, smart devices. But what if such responsiveness is older than we thought? And what if the Ark, like some ancient machine, was built not to act, but to respond, to signals, to intentions, to specific frequencies long forgotten? That would explain its strange behavior across the biblical texts, why it sometimes struck with deadly force and other times remained still, why it had to be carried a certain way, why even looking upon it could result in death. It wasn't arbitrary. It was protocol, a protocol that no one alive remembered how to follow. That kind of forgetting is dangerous, especially now. Because as we develop our own energy systems, wireless power, quantum communication, directed radiation, we're inching closer to recreating environments that might activate something dormant. Not through magic, through mimicry, through resonance. A forgotten pattern echoed in a new technology, a signal bouncing across time. What if the Ark has been waiting? Not for a person, for a pattern. And what if that pattern is being built again, not by intention, by accident? We imagine ancient objects as static. But what if they're listening? That's where the conversation turns, from history to responsibility. Because if the Ark is still out there, and still active, then our actions, even unknowing, might wake it, might provoke it, might reactivate functions no one has seen in centuries. And what would those functions be? Protection? Destruction? Communication? We can't know. And the ones who once did, priests, scribes, keepers, are gone, or silent, which is why we must return to the veils. The layers placed over the Ark were not just cloth or ritual. They were filters, barriers, ways of preventing contact, and more importantly, ways of preventing interaction, because interaction, when misunderstood, becomes catastrophe. We know this from our own science. Touching a nuclear core with bare hands isn't just dangerous, it's stupid. Yet without training, someone might not know, might reach out, might mean no harm, and still die. That's what the Ark represents now. Not just mystery, but risk. The kind of risk we no longer know how to assess, because we've forgotten the rules. The language is gone, the context is lost. But the object, perhaps, remains, waiting beneath stone, humming beneath story, nearer than we think, and maybe listening still. In 1963, a little-known military contractor operating in the Sinai Peninsula filed a request with the Israeli Ministry of Antiquities. The permit application was vague, claiming an intent to survey archaeological substructures of potential historical value. What was odd wasn't the application itself, but the company behind it, a logistics group with no known connection to archaeology. Its primary clients? Defense agencies. The request was denied. But within 6 months, satellite images showed construction in the area the group had tried to access. Low, temporary structures, and a fenced perimeter that appeared, then vanished within weeks. What were they looking for? Or more unsettling, what had they already found? Sometimes traces of lost objects appear not in excavation reports, but in anomalies, interruptions, the way signal static drifts across a communications band, the way a compass needle shudders when passing over sand that should be still, the way personnel files are altered, scrubbed, or closed. Patterns don't always form from what's present. Sometimes they form from what disappears. This pattern of hidden attempts, unexplained readings, sudden closures, continues across decades. It surfaces briefly, only to vanish again beneath layers of bureaucracy and disbelief. And in the center of that vortex, the arc. Not necessarily visible, not proven, but suggested, persistently. Like a buried fault line, its presence inferred from the tremors it causes above. If the arc is real, and if it has survived, it may be the last remaining interface from a time we no longer understand. A time when spiritual and technical knowledge were not separate, but fused. It's tempting to believe we invented this fusion in the modern world. That only now, with machines in our pockets and data in the air, have we reached the age of convergence. But what if we're only recovering what once was common? What if the arc is not ahead of us, but behind us? A remnant of a civilization that blended matter and meaning, energy and intention. And if so, what did they use it for? We always assume the worst. Weapons, control, domination. But perhaps the arc's danger was a byproduct, not a purpose. Like handling live electricity, it shocks not out of malice but misunderstanding. The biblical texts often mention the ark as a place where God met with Moses. A communication point, a voice from between the cherubim. What if this wasn't metaphor? What if the ark was a transmitter? Or even more strangely, a translator? A device that bridged not just speech, but form, turning thought into signal, or signal into presence. This might explain the intensity surrounding it. Why only one man could enter? Why even he had to prepare for days? Because the interaction wasn't casual. It was transformative, and potentially fatal. We are reminded of myths across cultures that speak of initiations, journeys into inner sanctums where only the pure could survive. Oracles who sat upon seats of stone and inhaled vapors said to bring prophecy. Temples where hearing the god was both blessing and burden. Was this metaphor? Ritualized imagination? Or was it the residue of technology so advanced it became indistinguishable from myth? The ark may have been part of such a system, a fragment of a larger whole, a node in a network no longer intact. And if that's the case, perhaps its silence isn't due to hiding, but disconnection. The rest of the system is gone. The inputs are missing. The signal is lost. Imagine an advanced radio, perfectly intact, but tuned to a frequency that no longer exists. It would seem broken, dead, until somewhere, someday, that frequency returned. What would the ark do? Would it awaken? Would it transmit? Would it call back? The implications are staggering, because then the ark isn't just a relic. It's a question left waiting for an answer. And maybe someone, somewhere, has already heard a reply. There are stories, fragments of people who claim they've seen things, not in caves or ruins, but in dreams. visions of golden boxes, winged figures, humming light. Most are dismissed as imagination, echoes of movies, stories, books, but a few are harder to shake. A pilot grounded after reporting a blinding structure hovering in a desert pass. A linguist who awoke from a fever dream with words in a tongue she didn't recognize, but which matched a reconstructed Proto-Semitic root once inscribed on the Ark's carrying poles. A child in Eritrea who drew a picture of the quiet box that sings. Coincidences? Probably. But the Ark, if it exists, would only reveal itself to those attuned to its presence, not the powerful, not the proud, but the sensitive, the fringe, those still capable of listening without certainty. That's the final paradox. The more we demand proof, the more the Ark retreats. But the more we soften, slow down, allow doubt, the more its outline takes shape. Not visibly, but impressionally, like something too bright to look at directly, or too ancient to fit into modern speech, so it waits, beneath stone, behind veils, within memory, and maybe within us. A signal waiting for response, a pattern seeking resonance, a question we've inherited whether we understand it or not, and the next time we feel the hum beneath our feet, or see something we cannot explain, or hear a voice not outside but within. Perhaps it's not madness, perhaps it's the Ark, still speaking, still listening, still waiting. There's a recurring image in the oldest stories of humanity. A container, something built to hold what should not be released. Sometimes it's a jar, like in the Greek tale of Pandora. Sometimes it's a chest, as in Sumerian myths. Sometimes a sealed cave, or a tower forbidden to climb. Always, the theme is the same. What is hidden is dangerous, and what is dangerous attracts us. The Ark of the Covenant fits this image with uncanny precision. A box, yes, but one designed never to be opened, not directly, not carelessly. It was to be shielded, covered, approached only by the few, and only with ritual. To touch it directly was death. To look inside, madness. The stories are clear about that. But what's less often asked is why something so central to a faith tradition, so sacred, was designed to be so lethal. Why would the divine presence choose a form so easily fatal to the very people chosen to protect it? Unless the danger was not divine wrath, but a technical side effect, a byproduct. In modern terms, we might call it overexposure, or breach of containment. We build systems today that operate on similar assumptions. Touch this, and you die. Not because it wants to kill you, but because of what it is. High-voltage transformers, fission cores, chemical stores that become toxic not out of intent, but by design. If the Ark belongs in this category, not symbolic, but functional, then its rituals begin to make sense. The incense isn't superstition, it's a chemical barrier. The golden covering isn't decoration, it's shielding. The layered veils aren't ceremony, they're insulation. And the purification? Perhaps not just spiritual, perhaps biological, preparing the body for proximity, minimizing contamination. Think of how we treat clean rooms today. Labs with strict protocols, sterile suits, air filtration. Not out of reverence, but necessity. Now imagine a world that inherited such an object without understanding it. They would protect it the only way they knew how, by wrapping it in religion. That's not blasphemy. That's preservation. And it raises a further question. What was the Ark meant to do? Not what it did in the hands of those who feared it, but what it was designed for originally. What function did it once serve? To contain? To transmit? To alter? or to bridge. There are scattered accounts, obscure, fragmented, that describe strange phenomena around the Ark not easily categorized. A low humming sound, changes in the behavior of nearby animals, odd patterns of sleep and dreaming among priests. One 16th century Ethiopian manuscript, rarely translated, contains a passage in which the Ark is described as that which unites heaven and earth through the tongue of fire. A poetic phrase, until you consider what it might mean literally. Tongue of fire could describe plasma discharge, or energy transfer, or even signal, light as language. In that light, the Ark becomes less like a relic, and more like a conduit. But a conduit to what? That's the part history no longer answers. We are left with fragments, texts that hint but never explain, images that echo across civilizations without convergence. In the Hindu Rig Veda, a golden chariot that speaks in lightning. In Norse myth, a box guarded by the gods that contains something older than them all. In Mayan belief, a stone chest that hums only when the sky is open. These are not parallels, but they rhyme, and sometimes rhyme matters more than proof. It points to memory, shared, dispersed, almost lost. So we come back to the Ark, not as a theological centerpiece, but as an artifact of forgotten knowledge. Knowledge that might once have belonged to everyone, and now belongs to no one. Because the Ark doesn't explain itself. It reacts, it waits, it moves, not through geography but through time, surfacing only when the conditions are right, and those conditions may be forming again. Not because of faith, because of frequency. There's a theory, quiet but growing, that the Ark may be tied to resonance. Not the musical kind, but the vibrational. That it responds to specific patterns in electromagnetic fields, that when these patterns return, through nature or technology, it may activate, not explode, not radiate, but open, not physically, not like a chest, but as an interface, an interaction point. And if so, then finding it isn't about digging, it's about tuning, calibrating, listening. What would that look like? Maybe a dream that isn't yours. Maybe a voice that speaks in geometry. Maybe a sound you can't record. It's strange. How many modern encounters with unexplained phenomena involve resonance? People report feeling things before seeing them. A pressure in the chest, a vibration in the bones, an unnatural stillness. Perhaps the Ark never left. Perhaps it never had to. Because it doesn't depend on location, it depends on alignment, like a signal bouncing across dimensions, waiting for something that remembers how to listen. And if that's true, then the question of where the Ark is may not matter. The question becomes, when? When will it return? Or more haunting, when will we? There's a place where memory begins to bend, not break, but ripple. A zone where time feels layered, folded. You've felt it, maybe, without knowing what to call it. A ruin where the wind feels wrong. A landscape where sound seems to arrive late. A room in which your thoughts don't feel entirely your own. Some physicists call it field disturbance, others, geomagnetic anomalies. But in the oldest stories, it was always something else. A thin place, a place where the boundary between what is and what was becomes permeable. It's in these places, the records say, that the Ark was most often felt. Not seen, not found, felt. In Shiloh, before Jerusalem, the Ark was kept for over 300 years. There is little left of that site today. Stone fragments, outlines of an old structure. But visitors still report unease there. A kind of low-frequency discomfort. Not loud, not sharp, but present. like something held just outside of hearing. Local guides dismiss it. Old stones and strong sun. But a handful of researchers brought instruments there once, on an unofficial basis. Their readings didn't match the geology. They didn't publish. They didn't return. This is not proof. But it is a pattern. Because wherever the Ark is said to have been, Shiloh, Kiryat Yearim, Jerusalem, Axum, Tannis, something lingers. Not radiation, not magnetism exactly. Something harder to name, like static across memory, like a trace left behind when the source has moved on. What kind of object leaves that behind? What kind of presence can move, but never quite vanish? Some believe the Ark, if real, is not a single object, but a phenomenon. That the gold-covered box was a housing, a carrier, but that what was inside, if anything, was something else entirely. A core, a node, an energy not born of this earth but shaped to move through it. That idea isn't as unthinkable as it once was. Today, scientists speak openly of quantum entanglement, of information traveling without transmission, of particles linked across space. The strangest forces in the universe are no longer imaginary. They are measurable, predictable, and perhaps repeatable. What if the Ark operated on such a principle? Not built, but calibrated, not wielded, but aligned, not powered by force, but by relationship. Relationship to what? That's where the silence returns. Some say to the divine, others say to something older than gods. Either way, the Ark may have been more than a tool. It may have been a bridge between dimensions, between intelligences, between ways of knowing we've since forgotten. There's a passage in an obscure translation of the Book of Jubilees, long excluded from canon, that speaks of the box of the watchers, carried by the priests, to keep the bond with the sky. Scholars treat it as metaphor, another poetic relic of apocalyptic imagination. But the word used, bond, is specific. A tether, a stabilizer, like something designed not only to preserve power, but to connect it across planes of existence. This raises unsettling possibilities, because a device designed to connect might also expose. And what if, in the process of contact, something else was invited in? Some traditions quietly suggest this, that after the Ark arrived in Jerusalem, visions increased, not always divine, sometimes maddening, that those who served closest to it began to speak in tongues, that dreams became warnings, that children were born who did not look like their parents. None of this is in the mainstream text, but folklore keeps the shadows intact, always, and in those shadows, the Ark waits, not as a golden chest, but as a lingering question. Because what happens when you bring something across a boundary you can't define? What happens when an ancient people, desperate for meaning, are given access to a bridge they do not know how to use? Do they build temples? Or do they dig graves? The Bible tells us the Ark brought victory and also ruin. It felled walls and cities. It created miracles and plagues. It saved and it destroyed, like something that did not choose sides, only responded, as if its behavior depended not on morality, but on resonance, on the match between itself and those who approached. Maybe the Ark didn't kill Uzzah because he touched it. Maybe it killed him because he was out of sync. That would explain the purification rituals, the garments, the incense, not to appease a wrathful deity, but to tune the body, the mind, the frequency. What if the high priest wasn't just performing tradition? What if he was preparing to interface? That makes the Holy of Holies not a sanctuary, but a chamber of alignment, And the Ark itself? Not a throne, a console. We are not used to thinking this way, but perhaps we should be. Because if the Ark is a console, one that connects us to something else, then the act of finding it carries new weight. It is not just archaeology. It is interaction. It is logging back in. To what? That's the part no one remembers. And maybe that's the reason for all the silence. Maybe the Ark was not hidden because of what it was, but because of what it contacted. Sometimes it's not what an object is that makes it dangerous. It's what it touches, what it opens, what it leaves behind in its wake. The Ark of the Covenant may not have been dangerous because of its own energy, but because it functioned as a key. And keys, once used, can't always lock the door again. Across ancient traditions, we find strange moments, interruptions in the normal storylines, episodes of sudden, inexplicable knowing, of dreams not rooted in one's own life, of voices speaking through people who never learned the language. These accounts were often wrapped in terms like prophecy or possession, but behind them all lingered something harder to name: contact. But with what? If the Ark acted as a bridge, as an interface between human perception and something external, it may have allowed something in. Not a creature, not necessarily a being at all, but an intelligence, an echo of something older. And here lies a theory only whispered among the most speculative researchers: that the Ark wasn't a gift. It was a remnant, a forgotten tool from a previous age, an age that knew how to reach out, but perhaps reached too far. Maybe the civilization that left the Ark behind was not destroyed by war, or drought, or time. Maybe it was undone by connection, not the act itself, but what followed. Imagine a culture that developed the ability to interact with a greater intelligence, a higher field, something not bound to time or matter or place. What begins as inspiration becomes conversation, becomes reliance, becomes dependence. And then something changes, not in the device, in the users. The Ark's presence in biblical history was always dual. It brought victory and it brought collapse. It unified tribes, but eventually disappeared before the empire fractured. Its last clear appearance is not triumph, but silence. What if the priests didn't lose the Ark? What if they chose to let it go? Because what came through the connection wasn't what they expected. This is a recurring fear in human thought. The Pandora's box, the forbidden knowledge, the fruit of the tree. But maybe those myths are not just psychological metaphors. Maybe they're inherited memories of real contact, of real consequences. If the Ark was once a tool for alignment, for communication, then it may still be active, but dormant, waiting for the right signal or the right question, and we, unknowingly, may be asking again. Through our satellites, our frequencies, our machines. Artificial intelligence is often trained to predict patterns, to finish what we begin. But what happens when our technology stumbles onto a pattern it didn't expect? When it begins to echo something we never taught it? There have been small incidents, in labs, in data sets, patterns that shouldn't emerge, noise that isn't noise, a burst of structure in the midst of randomness. Engineers dismiss it, or bury it, or quietly move on. But maybe they've brushed against the same signal, the one the Ark was built to receive, or amplify, or shield. It's impossible to know, because we no longer remember the protocol. We no longer recognize the architecture of interaction. But maybe the Ark remembers us. If it still exists, And if it's listening, then we are not searching alone. We are being watched, not with eyes, but with attention. And the most frightening thing about attention is that it responds. If the Ark is not just a relic, but an interface, then the act of studying it becomes an act of invitation. And in the ancient world, invitations came with conditions: ritual, reverence, alignment. Today we use force, we drill, we open, we expose. But the Ark was never meant to be exposed. It was meant to be approached, slowly, like a fire you can't see but can feel in your bones. That's the echo in every story, not of domination but of caution, of guardianship, of fear edged with awe. And maybe those who built the Ark, or inherited it, weren't the first to feel that fear. Maybe they were only the last to understand it. There are carvings in India, in Bolivia, in parts of Siberia, that depict figures seated between arcs of energy, wings or light, or something that blurs the edge of form. These figures are often surrounded by others with bowed heads, shielding their eyes. It's as if contact was once widespread, and then forbidden, buried, forgotten, until only the stories remained. And then even the stories faded. But the object, if it still exists, doesn't care whether we believe. It simply waits, its hum lost beneath the hum of our own machines, its pattern hidden beneath 1,000 signals, its presence ignored, until something responds. And if something responds, what will it want? Information, obedience, or just awareness? Perhaps the Ark's purpose was never to save or punish, but to awaken, to shift perception, to realign our minds with something older, larger, less personal, not a god, a system, an architecture, one that still surrounds us, but which we no longer see. The Ark might be a key to that vision, a portal, a permission, or a test. And maybe that's why it was hidden, not to protect it from us, but to protect us from ourselves. There's a kind of silence that doesn't just fill the air, it changes it. It thickens the space around thought. It makes your breath feel slower. Not from fear, exactly, from presence. The sense that something ancient and watching is near. That's the silence people describe in the places where the Ark may have been. It isn't absence, it's weight. And sometimes weight can be more revealing than sound. In the monastery at Debre Demo, northern Ethiopia, an oral tradition survives that tells of a voice without speaker that once issued from a sealed relic carried through the mountains during a time of war. The story, passed in whispers from monk to monk, says the voice came only when all others had fallen silent, when even the wind stopped. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it simply was. It spoke in no known tongue, but they understood it, or they remembered understanding. That kind of story is easy to dismiss, too poetic, too abstract. But it aligns, again, with an older theme. That the Ark was not only something to be carried, but something that carried information. Not words, not doctrines, something more foundational. Pattern. Some researchers speculate that the Ark could have been a kind of harmonic resonator, that its proportions, its gold plating, the way the cherubim faced each other, all combined to focus vibration. Not just sound waves, but electromagnetic patterns, the kind that affect consciousness, memory, perception. In other words, the Ark may not have contained God. It may have altered the human mind to experience something divine. That changes the question entirely. Because then the Ark's danger isn't in what it does, it's in what it reveals. A shift in reality so sudden, so absolute, that the unprepared mind collapses beneath it. That might explain why those who touched it died, not from radiation, not from some wrathful burst, but from unshielded awareness, like opening a door and seeing not a room, but the entire sky, all at once, pressing in. That kind of revelation could kill, not the body, but the sense of self. And maybe that's why only the high priest could approach. Not because he was chosen, but because he was trained, prepared, tuned, to hold the signal without breaking. The Ark, then, becomes not just a relic or a device, but a threshold, one that could open not a place, but a perception, a view into a layer of reality not usually visible, not normally survivable. That sounds like science fiction, until you realize it already happens. Psychedelic substances, in controlled environments, have shown the capacity to shift perception so deeply that people speak of contact, of communion, of seeing geometries and intelligences far beyond language, and these substances affect the brain through chemistry alone. Now imagine a device, non-chemical, that did the same through frequency, through shape, through proximity, no pills, no rituals, just standing close enough, long enough, tuned just right. And the veil begins to thin. That's what the Ark might have been, not a miracle, a machine for opening consciousness. And if that's true, then hiding it wasn't an act of theft. It was mercy, because most people aren't ready, not to see more, but to see differently. We build our sense of self on edges, between me and you, light and dark, known and unknown. The Ark may have dissolved those edges, not violently, just completely, and to a mind not trained for that kind of dissolution, the result could feel like death, maybe not even metaphorically. And yet, there were always those who sought it. Not just kings and priests, but mystics, people who longed not for power, but for understanding. They called it many names: the light, the voice, the presence, and they sought it not to control, but to listen. It's possible that even now, somewhere, someone is still listening. Not to find the Ark, but to remember how to perceive what it shows. This brings us to a quiet and disconcerting idea that the Ark never left. It never had to be moved, buried, or lost, because it's not just a physical object. It's a condition, a resonance that can emerge anywhere if the right alignment occurs. That would explain why stories of the Ark, or things like it, appear not just in the Middle East, but globally. The chest of fire in Polynesian myth, the stone casket in Siberian shamanism, the golden box beneath the mountain in Welsh legend. All doors, all keys, all reminders. Maybe what we call the Ark is a template, a pattern that manifests when certain physical and mental structures are aligned. A geometry of awakening. Not imposed, uncovered. And if that's true, then the original Ark was not the only one. It was just the one that worked, or the one that was remembered. Which leads us to ask, if this pattern can be remembered, can it be built again? Not by accident, by design, not for power, for reconnection. We have the materials. We have the measurements. What we lack is context, and the willingness to listen instead of command. Because if the Ark returns, it won't arrive with thunder. It will arrive in silence, in that thickening of space, in the breath that slows, not from fear, but from awareness. And in that silence we may remember what it means to be more than one thing, to be both flesh and signal, to be both story and code, to carry something ancient not in our hands, but in our minds. There is a concept, buried deep in both ancient mysticism and modern physics, that the world is not what it seems, but what it resonates as. That behind solid matter lies vibration, pattern, harmonics, a field where everything touches everything else, not through space, through frequency. It is in this kind of world that the arc makes the most sense, not as a holy container, but as a harmonic engine. A device that, when placed in certain conditions, when surrounded by sound, intention, material, and mind, doesn't produce light or power as we usually define them, but something more subtle. Alignment. Between the inside and the outside. Between the human and the unknown. There are stories in the Talmud, quiet and fragmentary, that suggest the ark moved on its own, that the Levites who carried it didn't bear the full weight, that sometimes it lifted, and not just upward, forward. What does that mean? Metaphor? Or movement governed by interaction with space? Imagine an object not driven by fuel, but by field, by the resonance between what it is made of and what surrounds it. Gold and acacia, stone and air, but also prayer, sound, intention. That would make the ark not just a passive relic, but a responsive one. It would mean it behaved differently depending on who approached it. Not out of judgment, out of resonance. Some who drew near fell dead. Others heard a voice. Maybe they weren't different people. Maybe they were in different states, aligned or not. This idea is echoed in other texts, other traditions. In the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, the soul must know the names of the gates it passes through, not because names are passwords, but because knowing shapes resonance. It tunes the self to the structure, and only when tuned can you pass unharmed. The ark may have been such a gate, and the priests were not guards, they were tuners, maintainers of a delicate frequency between this world and the next. That could explain why the ark was placed in a box within a box within a box, not just for reverence, for containment, because when frequency leaks, it changes the space around it. It creates interference, distortion, sometimes death. And yet, we keep trying to find it. Why? Not for faith, not anymore, for function. Because even in our modern era, with our computers and telescopes and quantum laboratories, something remains missing. A thread? A link? A bridge between knowledge and meaning. We can measure the world, but we can't always feel it. We can explain the particles, but we can't explain why some places, some objects, still make us tremble. Maybe the ark was a tool to bring those two halves back together. Not to rule, to remind. That behind the data is pattern, and behind the pattern is song. Some engineers have attempted to reconstruct the ark based on the descriptions in Exodus. They've followed the dimensions, used the gold, built the cherubim. And when they finished, what they had was a box. No hum, no light, no voice. But maybe that's because the design was never the whole story. Like building a violin without knowing how to tune or what melody to play. The ark's activation may have depended not on construction, but on place and time and mind. That's why it cannot be recreated in a lab, because it was never just an object. It was an event, a convergence, and that convergence is not always ours to choose. It chooses us. There are reports, quiet, hidden, of strange dreams among those who work near ancient power centers. Dreams of sound, of wings, of pressure in the chest. Some wake with nosebleeds, others with knowledge they didn't have before, maps, symbols, words they have to look up, only to find they're real. These things are dismissed, coincidence, stress, but perhaps they are proximity, echoes from a signal still trying to reach us. And perhaps the ark is not in one place, Perhaps it is many places temporarily, phasing in and out of what we call reality, not because it moves, because the field shifts. And when it does, the door reappears, just long enough for someone to remember. That might be the greatest danger of all. Not that we'll find the Ark and open it, but that we'll find it and forget again. Touch it without tuning, approach without awe, disassemble without understanding, and lose once more the thing that made it sing. That's why the story matters, not for proof, for preparation, because someday someone will stand in the right place, at the right time, with the right vibration, and the Ark will respond, not as a weapon, not as a relic, but as a voice calling us back, not to ancient power, but to ancient memory, and the choice it still carries. There's something about forgotten knowledge that never truly stays lost. It lingers, caught in the folds of language, etched into patterns we don't fully recognize, humming beneath architecture whose meaning has long slipped through our fingers. You can feel it in places with no reason to feel anything at all. A temple's broken corner, a stone in the wrong orientation, a doorway that leads nowhere but still insists on existing. This is where the Ark leaves its fingerprints, not through monuments, but through anomalies. In 1997, an independent group of researchers scanned an underground chamber near Mount Nebo in Jordan, traditionally believed to be the site from which Moses viewed the Promised Land. Their equipment, meant for geological mapping, picked up a large rectangular void beneath a layer of stone thought to be natural bedrock, perfectly proportioned, aligned to true north, completely sealed. They never received a permit to excavate. The team disbanded quietly. One member, years later, published a small paper, barely circulated, suggesting the void could be artificial. A carved structure with shielding properties, she called it. Shielding from what, she didn't say. The implication was enough. Because if the Ark wasn't destroyed, but hidden, then it was likely done in a way that would erase not just its location, but its context. To bury an object is one thing. To erase the memory of how to use it, that takes intention. And that's where the trail leads again and again, not just to absence, but to erasure. The temple records that once detailed ritual vanished. The blueprints from the Second Temple lost. The scrolls that may have held the Ark's handling procedures burned, buried, or locked in archives no one can access. If the Ark were a fable, this wouldn't be necessary. No one censors bedtime stories. Only blueprints. Only knowledge that can be rebuilt. And maybe that's what someone feared most. Not the Ark falling into the wrong hands, but the Ark working again. Because if it activated once, through alignment, through frequency, through ritual, then it could activate again. And maybe it already has. There's a passage in the Dead Sea Scrolls that speaks of a box of silence hidden in the place of dry thunder, said to awaken when the stars speak again as they did in the first days. No explanation, no details, just the idea that conditions, celestial, temporal, human, could reappear. That the resonance that once allowed the Ark to function wasn't a one-time event. It was a cycle. And that cycle, slowly, might be closing again. It's possible that certain materials, gold, acacia, stone, weren't chosen for their symbolism, but for their responsiveness to fields we barely understand. Piezoelectric resonance, low-frequency oscillation, interaction with Schumann waves, the planet's own natural heartbeat. We measure these things now, but do we comprehend them? What if the Ark did? Not through language, but design. What if it was built not just to survive the ages, but to await them? To sit quietly until the conditions returned, until we built again what we once destroyed. That would explain the urgency behind the efforts to keep it buried. Not out of reverence, but out of necessity. Because when machines lose their operators, they become unpredictable. And the Ark was never a thing to be trusted without understanding. We are reminded again of those who died merely by drawing too close. Not in battle, in curiosity, in reverence without preparation. There's a story, almost erased from the records, about a small group of medieval scholars who claimed to possess an object said to contain light without flame. They never said where it came from, only that it had to be kept wrapped in cloth and buried within walls lined with copper. Their names are forgotten, their monastery burned. Only a single sketch survives. 2 winged figures facing each other, arms extended over a square object. Not proof, but a whisper. And whispers, over time, become threads, and threads, if followed carefully, become maps. But even maps can be dangerous, because what they reveal may not only be location, but timing. We think of history as behind us, a series of moments we survive, then study. But the Ark refuses that structure. It surfaces, it vanishes, it loops, like a story trying to finish itself in the present tense. And if we are part of that story, then we are not just readers. We are participants, whether we know it or not. The signs are subtle. A surge in interest, a return of rituals, a convergence of technologies with dreams. We speak now of quantum presence, of coherence, of zero-point fields, and without knowing it, we are rebuilding the world the Ark once required to function. Maybe not on purpose, maybe not yet with clarity, but the resonance is forming. And somewhere, beneath stone, behind myth, within silence, the Ark is listening. It always has been, because it doesn't forget, it doesn't sleep, it doesn't need belief, only alignment, only time, and now, perhaps time is catching up. In the museum archives of southern France, stored in a drawer mislabeled Liturgical Curiosities, there is a small, faded page from the 13th century. On it, in Latin, is written a phrase, Arca non clausa est, sed dormiant. The Ark is not sealed, but sleeping. There is no reference point, no author, no context, just the sentence, and a sketch. The image shows a cube surrounded by wave lines, like ripples from a stone dropped into water. Above it, a star. Below, what appear to be roots. No angels, no flames, no divine figure, just shape, energy, connection. Whoever drew it saw the Ark not as a container, but as a process. Not something you open, but something that opens under the right conditions. A sleeper, not inert, not dead, dormant. The idea changes everything. Because a dormant object is not forgotten. It's waiting. And the ones who hid it, they may have known this, may have chosen not to destroy it, not because they couldn't, but because they feared what reawakening would mean. Not only for themselves, but for what lay beyond the veil. In nearly every tradition that references an ark, chest, or divine vessel, there is a warning. Do not look upon it. Do not touch. Do not open. But why? Because of what's inside? Or because of what happens to you when you do? We often think of danger as external, something projected outward. But what if the true risk of the ark was internal amplification? Not a curse, but a mirror. What if the ark shows you everything? Not symbolically, not in dreams, but directly. Your thoughts, your past, your intentions, and what lies beyond them. Such an encounter could be unbearable, Not because the Ark judges, but because it reflects. Fully. Without filter. That might explain the deaths. The madness, the awe, the glory, the terror. If you saw the truth of yourself, without the buffer of language or ego, would you survive it? Would you remain? Or would you dissolve into light or dust or something in between? Maybe that's what the priests feared. Maybe that's what the veils were for. Not to hide the Ark, to shield the human. We see this concept again in Kabbalistic thought. The idea that divine light must be contracted before it enters the world, tzimtzum, a shrinking, a dimming, not because the light is cruel, but because it is too much. The Ark may have functioned as a point of contact between worlds, a place where full light passed through veils into shadow, where knowledge dripped slowly into consciousness, drop by drop, ritual by ritual. But if the veils are lifted too fast, flood. And if modern humanity, untrained and impatient, were to lift those veils now, without the discipline, the context, the humility, what would happen? We're not trained to receive. We're trained to dissect, to reduce, to analyze. But the Ark cannot be analyzed. It can only be entered, not physically, energetically. And if we enter without preparation, what follows might not be revelation. It might be rupture. We are reminded of the Tower of Babel, a story not about sin, but about reach, about trying to ascend too quickly, to touch the divine without the inner structure to hold what came next. The result was not punishment, it was confusion, a shattering of language, a scattering of mind. Perhaps the Ark was built not to prevent such shattering, but to allow safe encounter, a controlled meeting point, a temple not of stone, but of structure, a buffer zone between what we are and what we are not yet. But it can't function alone. It needs alignment, not of parts, of people, of place, of purpose. That's why no one has truly found it. Because finding isn't just about digging, it's about readiness. And that's the part we don't talk about. Talk. Are we ready? To see beyond narrative? To feel beyond self? To open a door that does not close once walked through? There are stories, modern ones, of people who claim to have been near it, not in deserts, in dreams, in moments of stillness so deep they felt displaced. One described a room without walls filled with sound that spoke without language. Another, a pressure in the chest like gravity had changed direction. These accounts are unprovable, but they echo. And echo is a form of truth, especially when it repeats across cultures, centuries, minds that never met. Something is there, not a relic, a resonance, and the closer we draw, individually, collectively, the louder that resonance becomes. Until one day, it finds a match, a body, a time, a frequency just right, and the Ark, no longer asleep, will wake. Not with fire, not with thunder, but with knowing, and in that moment we'll have to decide not what it is, but who we are. There is something about thresholds that never quite feels safe. Doorways, cracks between stone, moments at the edge of sleep. These are the places where the world softens, where control slips slightly out of reach, where, for just an instant, something ancient peers through from the other side. The Ark of the Covenant may have been a threshold, not simply an artifact or container, but a membrane. Between the visible and the invisible, between structure and signal, between history and something that refuses to be history. This is why its disappearance doesn't behave like the loss of a normal object. There was no theft, no destruction, only the closing of a door, a thickening of silence, a carefully layered forgetting. And yet, something remains, not the object, perhaps, but the field. Some researchers believe that certain places still carry a residue, a geometric echo, a faint but measurable shift in how time is experienced, how perception unfolds. One researcher called it chronodilation drift, the sense that within specific spatial ratios, human awareness alters, slows, repeats, opens. It's a term without official standing, a theory without formal data. But those who've felt it say it's real. They describe walking through old ruins, sometimes not even aware they've crossed into a space until the change occurs. A thickening of thought, a sense of pressure behind the eyes, a vertigo not of height, but of scale. Something vast brushing against the self. Perhaps this is what the priests once felt. Not fear, not holiness, but proximity to something they could not contain, only host. And if the ark was the central point of this field, the eye in a structure of resonance, then its physical presence may not have been as important as the space it created. A spatial logic, a memory that lives in form. We often speak of sacred geometry as decoration, but what if it's functional? Not symbol, but structure, not belief, but technology. The tabernacle, where the ark first rested, was built to precise instructions, lengths, heights, materials, ratios, no improvisation, no flair, just structure, purpose, and the Holy of Holies was cubic, a space of perfect symmetry. In mathematics, a cube is a stabilizing form. In acoustics, it's a resonant chamber. In certain theories of consciousness, a cube is a frame within which consciousness can amplify. What if the ark required such a frame? Not to amplify itself, to hold open the door. But the door to where? That's the question no one wants to ask aloud. Because once you ask it, you have to consider what was on the other side. The Bible speaks of God's presence as descending between the cherubim, as a voice that Moses heard, as if from above the ark. But the word used in Hebrew for presence is Shekinah, a feminine noun, often associated with radiance, indwelling, light, not a figure, a force, a presence that fills space, a field. Some believe the ark was built not to contain God, but to create a window through which the Shekinah could be felt, a lens, a conductor, and lenses can be pointed in both directions. What if the ark didn't just allow a divine force to enter? What if it allowed us to be seen? And if so, by whom? That question lingers in certain mystical texts, rarely translated, whispers of those who listen through the pattern, not angels, not gods, but watchers, not in the moral sense, in the literal one. Observers. Perhaps the ark was not about revelation. Perhaps it was about surveillance, a beacon, an announcement, a flare in the dark saying, "We are here." This theory, though fringe, raises uncomfortable possibilities. What if the activation of the ark wasn't a miracle? It was a message, not to us, from us, and the power it displayed, plagues, storms, voices, was not its own, but the echo of a response, a reply, from the other side of the field. That would mean the ark is not dormant. It's known, tracked, even now, and if it were to reappear, visibly, functionally, it might not only wake up, it might be answered. This brings us full circle, back to the silence, not as emptiness, but as tension. The pause before something returns, the delay before something reaches back. Because if the ark is a transmitter, not metaphorically but truly, then its retrieval is not just archaeological, it is existential, the kind of event that redefines everything, who we are, where we came from, What exactly is listening, and whether we're ready to speak again, or whether the next time we'll only listen. Imagine, just for a moment, that everything we've built, our systems, our science, our stories, sits atop something older, not buried beneath us, but beneath awareness, like a frequency just beyond the edge of hearing, like a presence in the room that hasn't yet spoken. This is how the Ark moves now. Not through history books, through hum. The hum of strange architecture. The hum of coincidence too persistent to be ignored. The hum of forgotten geometry showing up in places it was never meant to be. In 2011, a team of engineers studying acoustic harmonics in sacred spaces noted an anomaly in an underground chamber beneath northern Italy. The structure, unassuming from above, produced sustained harmonic tones at specific low frequencies when a human voice spoke at precise intervals. These tones did not echo. They hovered. It was as if the space responded. One of the engineers later wrote, in a private journal, that the sensation was not auditory, but felt through the ribs and behind the eyes. He compared it to a cathedral organ, but also to pressure changes he had experienced inside particle accelerators. No one mentioned the Ark, but the measurements spoke anyway. Cubic resonance, stone vaulting, orientation toward rising stars, and at the chamber's center, a rectangular slab of gold-colored alloy. Not ancient, but recently placed. No one knew by whom. The research was paused. The team disbanded. Nothing published. But this pattern of response keeps appearing. Not just in temples or ruins, but in places with no clear history at all. Random mountain passes. Caves with no carvings, no bones. Just stillness. Old libraries where visitors report dizziness near certain shelves. Rooms with no draft, but doors that whisper, and always the same feeling. Not that something is coming, that something has been here all along. The Ark may not have vanished. It may have decentralized. No longer one golden box, but a network of thresholds. A signal refracted through time and matter, waiting for the right receptors. Not devices. People. If that sounds strange, consider this. Every sacred story once began with a person hearing something no one else could. A whisper in the dark, a name spoken from nowhere. A dream that carried too much clarity to dismiss. Prophets, visionaries, saints. But what if it wasn't divine favor? What if it was reception? What if some people, some minds, simply tuned in, like radios finally finding the right dial? The Ark, then, becomes not an object, but a protocol, a handshake between fields, between presence and perception. And this might be why the original Ark had to be hidden. Not because it was dangerous in itself, but because the world wasn't ready for what it made possible. Because when the veil is lifted, even slightly, the most fragile thing isn't what you see, it's what you become. People crave truth, but truth without preparation can fracture. And the Ark doesn't explain. It reflects, it responds, it reveals. Not what is outside, but what lies buried beneath your surface. That's the warning in every story. Not, do not touch the Ark, but do not touch it until you know what you're carrying, because the Ark makes visible what you've hidden from yourself, and that kind of contact can't be undone. Some traditions say the Ark was never meant to remain in one place, that it moves, not through geography, but alignment, that it appears when needed and disappears when misused, a self-regulating gate, a nomadic threshold, a keeper of balance. And perhaps it was never meant for permanent residence in temples, Perhaps it belonged in motion, among people, among stories, among questions. Maybe that's why it left, not as punishment, as protection, from us or for us, because knowledge without context becomes weapon, and the Ark was never a weapon. It only responded like one when misunderstood. That distinction matters, because it means the Ark isn't lost. It's just quiet, listening for readiness, for resonance, for a pattern strong enough, still enough, patient enough to hold what it carries. And maybe that's happening again, not because of religion, because of curiosity, the return of listening, of deep pattern recognition, of people slowing down long enough to hear the spaces between noise. And what lives there? Maybe the Ark won't come back as a flash of light. Maybe it will return as a question, one so soft, so persistent, it feels like your own thought. Not from above, from within, asking not what you believe, but what you're willing to remember. At the edge of every mystery there is a choice, not to solve it, to stay with it, to let the questions breathe as if they too are alive, changing shape each time they are asked. The Ark of the Covenant does not conclude its story. It simply recedes, like the tide pulling back, revealing new contours each time it disappears. What began as a box of gold and stone has become something else, a mirror, a gate, a pattern that outlives memory. And we've followed that pattern, not in a straight line, but in spirals, through ruined temples and silent monasteries, through fragments of scripture and fragments of sound, through scientific papers no longer cited and oral stories no longer spoken aloud. What we've seen isn't a relic, it's a rhythm, one that pulses beneath architecture, beneath belief systems, beneath human consciousness itself. Something that has waited not to be found, but to be felt again. And it's not waiting for all of us, just for those who pause long enough to notice what's been humming behind the world all along. In the end, the Ark doesn't point to power. It points to readiness, because to truly encounter what it may hold, truth, contact, memory, we must ask what kind of vessel we are becoming. Can we carry it? Can we stand in its field without collapsing under the weight of what we've forgotten? Can we remember not just the stories, but the listening that made them possible? This is not about belief, it's about alignment. The kind of inner architecture that doesn't need stone or gold, but attention, coherence, willingness to unlearn. In that sense, the Ark may not need to return. It may already be present, distributed across moments of clarity, found in the spaces between thoughts, in the silence that deepens, not with emptiness, but with invitation. And if you listen closely, that invitation never ended. You hear it when your breath slows for no reason, when a memory arrives that isn't quite yours, when a shape in a dream stays with you long after waking. The Ark is not an answer. It's a door, and the door leads inward as much as outward, to places we sealed long ago because they scared us with their immensity, with their intimacy, with their truth. And yet, the door remains, not closed, not open, just waiting. So now we return to the beginning, to a golden box in a tent surrounded by fire and song, to a voice that spoke not from above, but from between, to the silence that followed, not because the story ended, but because it began again in a new way, in each listener, in each echo, in each pause. Maybe we were never meant to find the Ark, only to become still enough to remember how to hear it. Maybe the mystery is not what it is, but why it still matters. Why, after centuries, something inside us stirs when we hear its name. The Ark, not just of the Covenant, but of memory, of transmission, of what was once possible and might be again. And so we leave the trail not with conclusions, but with space for you to wonder, to trace your own thread, to return to the places you've felt something strange but never named, because sometimes the threshold doesn't need to be crossed, only noticed. Sometimes, mystery is its own kind of answer, and the deeper question is this: if the Ark is waiting, who will we be when we reach it?